Water Strategy. If you want to introduce yourselves as we go and just start the beginning of the slideshow. Thank you.
Kia ora, Dave Allen, Manager, Natural Environment Strategy. Just wanted to make some opening observations on this annual report for the Auckland Water Strategy. This, of course, is a requirement of the committee to bring you a annual progress report. This is the first year we've done this since the strategy was approved in March 22. And so it has taken a bit of work to bring this together in the last couple of months by my team here. We're only reporting on the water strategy, of course, and this is not about specific projects in particular locations necessarily. This is about the themes of work that the council needs to look at in terms of making progress on better water outcomes for the region. And I guess it's important to just reflect on the fact that the former governing body spent about 20 workshops together focusing on what were the priority issues that needed to be addressed in a strategy. And a strategy document looks to then inform a number of other tertiary documents within the organisation that will actually direct activity on the ground. So that could be an asset management plan, it could be some of the local board plans, it could be some of the other department or CCO plans for interventions. And I guess the strategy as such is a very useful document to help with integration across a number of different themes of work with water. It also makes more transparent the council's response to water challenges across the region. It also speaks to some of the other things that may be not seen as immediately connected, such as biodiversity outcomes or how we look at infrastructure renewals or things like that. So it actually speaks to a range of different influencing factors on water outcomes more generally. So this is, as I said, the first report. It just gives you a pretty good idea as to how I've been kicking off since March 22 when the strategy was approved by the governing body. And I'll now hand it across to the team here to introduce themselves before they get underway with the presentation. So, Tess or Liv.
Kia ora, Dave. Ko Olivia Blanchette, tōku ingoa. I'm a Senior Analyst with the Natural Environment Strategy Unit.
And malo elele, my name is Tess Langworthy. I'm the Project Manager Water with the Natural Environment Strategy Unit as well. So we might jump straight into it. Okay, so as you know, we are here to provide you with the inaugural annual progress on the Auckland Water Strategy for 2022-2023. Over the course of this particular presentation, we will touch on a snapshot of the progress over the first year of implementation of this 30-year strategy, highlight areas of risk for Council to address over the long term, and also identify priorities for the coming year. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the water strategy does span over 30 years and was adopted by Auckland Council to direct council group activities relating to water. The strategy is guided by the vision Te Mauri o Te Wai, the life-sustaining capacity of Auckland's water is protected and enhanced. And the strategy directs actions through 8 strategic shifts that you'll see in front of you. These shifts represent transformational change along specific themes, and those shifts are Shift 1, Te Tiriti Partnership, Shift 2, Empowered Aucklanders, Shift 3, Sustainable Allocation and Equitable Access, Shift 4, Regenerative Water Infrastructure, Shift 5, Water Security, Shift 6, Integrated Land Use and Water Planning, Shift 7, Restoring and Enhancing Water Ecosystems, and Shift 8, Pooling Knowledge. Each of those strategic shifts is also underpinned by a further 6 to 10 actions with indicative timeframes that are set out in the implementation plan of the strategy to help us achieve those actions. Note also that some of these shifts also have specific quantitative targets attached to them. For example, Shift 5 does have targets around water consumption and water collection through to 2050. This annual report, however, does focus on how we're tracking against specific actions that underpin the shifts and targets that we're able to quantify in year 1. So a little bit of a history on the development and engagement of the strategy. So discussions initially started in 2017 with a focus on 3 waters, drinking, storm and wastewater. However, engagement with Mana Whenua specifically directed us towards a more holistic strategy for Auckland, and the vision of Te Mauri o Te Wai was gifted in 2019. Development of the content occurred particularly in 2021 with regular workshops with the governing body, as well as 2 series of hui with individual Mana Whenua entities on content, together with the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management Plan Change team. In 2021, the targets were adopted, and in 2022, the strategy was adopted by the Environment and Climate Change Committee. Following adoption, Year 1 of implementation commenced on the 1st of July 2022, and throughout the last year, engagement with Mana Whenua continued through Pānui and 2 additional series of hui together with the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management and Water Services Reform teams. And finally, in June 2023, we did present on the progress of the strategy to Te Pōtaio. In regards to alignment of the strategy, council group staff do need to respond to various drivers in fulfilling our obligations under the Local Government and Resource Management Acts, including central government obligations, council objectives and commitments to the public through our ongoing operations and initiatives. The strategy helps us to align those various drivers for the holistic outcomes that we want for Auckland. For example, central government's National Policy Statement for Urban Development requires us to develop a future development strategy that took direction from the Auckland Water Strategy's Shift 6, Integrated Land Use and Water Planning. This was specifically around improving spatial planning to consider water consistently and reduce development in high-risk areas. This was alongside direction from Te Taruki Atawhiri, Auckland's climate plan. Additionally, the Resilient Auckland initiative, which includes making space for water, also responds to flooding impacts and took direction from the water strategy. The initiative will advance its direction around blue-green network planning and water-sensitive design going forward.
Kia ora. I'll move into an overview of progress in Year 1, summarizing the information that's included in the annual report and its appendices. And before diving in, I do think it's helpful just to recap the operating context for the year that this report covers, which was an eventful one for Auckland, particularly in the water space. We had local government elections late in 2022 and the subsequent development of a new annual budget, which required staff to adjust to some shifting priorities in the new term. Additionally, in early 2023, we had the flooding impacts of January, February, and March, which required significant resourcing and responses by staff at an operational and strategy level. And then throughout the course of this year, ongoing central government reforms, particularly in the water services space, but also to resource management, introduced some uncertainty for long-term planning. Nonetheless, staff have implemented the strategy over the course of Year 1, primarily in these 2 ways. Embedding its direction in our ongoing work, noting that strategy is just one thing among a number of factors that staff consider in carrying out our functions related to water, and Tess has highlighted some of the great ways through drafting of the future development strategy and implementing the NPS for freshwater management that staff have done this over the course of this year. And the second way is through initiating new work programs to deliver specific actions. And the report has great examples around piloting empowerment approaches with Aucklanders, developing our understanding of water literacy, and adding MODI as an investment criteria in the annual budget process for capital expenditures. The annual report really focuses on tracking strategic shift in actions, as it's just looking at the first year of implementation, as well as targets for which we have metrics. And so this slide provides a very high-level overview of how actions are tracking at the end of Year 1. So you can see here across the top the 8 different strategic shifts and then the actions that underpin them. There are 58 actions in total in the strategy, and half of those are underway at the end of Year 1, noting that many are not scoped to begin until Year 2 or later. Actions that are underway are given a red, amber, green status, and that's primarily based on how they're tracking against the timeframes that are set out in the implementation plan that accompanies the water strategy. Red indicates that an action is overdue at the time of reporting. Amber indicates that it's tracking within the timeframes given but has some identified risks or challenges. And green indicates that it's tracking well within the timeframes, or in some cases might be functionally complete. Of the actions scoped to begin in Year 1, 90% of those are tracking as green or amber at the time of reporting, which is positive news. Of the 10% that are not, there are 3 actions that make up those overdue overdue red items. And the intention for all of those is to complete them in year 2, and all 3 of them are underway at the time of reporting. These 3 actions were impacted by inconsistent or insufficient resourcing over the course of this year, with some specifically impacted by the reallocation of staff following the flooding events of 2023. 4 actions have been marked as complete or functionally complete, and functionally complete just indicates that the action has an ongoing nature, and so significant progress was made in year 1, but they'll need to continue to be reviewed, and those are indicated on the slide with stars. Another tool for tracking implementation is monitoring our progress towards quantitative targets that are set out in the strategy. The water security targets focus on per capita consumption and non-reservoir recycled and rainwater capacity for beneficial use. And water care metrics over the course of this year show that we have achieved the targets we set out for ourselves by 2030. The average consumption of drinking water in Auckland over the course of this year was 241.33 litres per day per person, based on a rolling 12-month average. And we acknowledge that the reporting documents reflect this number in millions of litres per capita, which is an error. We would be well off our targets if our consumption was in millions of litres per person. And so we will be correcting that for the final report that's going to be published. The recycled water capacity for Auckland over the course of this year was 21.7 million litres per day, and that does not include rainwater tank volumes across Auckland, and therefore we estimate that that number is probably even greater. And so this is really positive news that we're tracking well against these targets. However, we do note the record rainfall that was experienced across Auckland over the course of early 2023, and a need to continue to focus on supporting water efficiency and diversifying our water supply through implementation of the strategy going forward. One of the purposes of reporting annually on the progress of the strategy is to be able to identify and mitigate risks early on. And over the course of year 1, we've identified 2 main risks to ongoing implementation. The strategy isn't supported by a targeted rate or a significant budget. It really relies on the commitment of staff to prioritize its direction in our ongoing work. And limited resourcing is the most commonly cited risk by implementing staff, especially with the demands this year around the water services reform and the flooding responses. We've identified 2 mitigation approaches here. One involves supporting staff that are making difficult decisions about where to allocate limited resourcing by identifying high priority actions for implementation. And another approach is to seek funding for priority actions through the long-term plan. Another related risk to flag is that the strategy lacks an enforcement mechanism. It's not a statutory obligation, it's a commitment by Auckland Council Group staff, and therefore competing demands can present a risk for accountability for delivery. An identified mitigation approach here is to consider an internal governance mechanism that could support buy-in across the council group over the course of year 2. And now that we've covered some of the key areas of implementation, I'll move into the next steps. I mentioned that one of our mitigation approaches was supporting staff with implementation by identifying some of the highest priority actions. These are the criteria that were used in that assessment for year 2, and the results were intended to prioritize actions that deliver on the vision of the strategy of Te Mauri o Te Wai within the timeframes that are given, and that have opportunities for efficient delivery by linking up and having strategic alignment with other high priority council initiatives. And the next slide will show some of the priority actions that resulted for year 2 and that will be prioritized going forward. And it's important to note that this doesn't mean that these are the only actions that will progress over the course of year 2 and ongoing. It just means that this is a tool to help identify where limited resources could be allocated for maximum impact. And so these are the top 10 priority actions for next year. They're not in priority order, they're in the order that they appear in the water strategy. And at a glance, they reflect our statutory obligations with things like implementing the Essential Freshwater Package and National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, opportunities for linkages with other programs, including direction around a Blue-Green Network spatial plan and resilience building, and prioritization of Te Mauri o Te Wai.
And before we conclude this presentation, we would like to reiterate that the organisation is going through significant changes in the water space, and particularly as we transition into Entity A. And so the strategy is an Auckland-specific product that guides us through these changes with a central vision for Auckland. And as I just mentioned before, the water services reform is a good example of that. As we transition to Entity A, we will work together with them to ensure that the regulatory requirements are achieved along with Council's own strategic objectives being met. And going forward, Council staff will continue to monitor and track progress of strategic actions, shifts and targets, continue to engage with and update local board members and mana whenua through briefing hui and appropriate fora, continue to report to the governing body annually each September, and if I can draw your attention to the gold circles on the screen in front of you, we will also act on the additional deliverables such as the dual benchmarking approach, which will score the city against the Water Sensitive Cities Index and the Mātauranga Māori benchmarking framework. Thank you.
We're happy to take questions now as well. Thanks.
Kia ora, thank you very much. And once again, huge amount of work, lots of progress from where we were a year ago, and some of those figures are pretty impressive too. Did you have the overall daily figure I hadn't got from Watercare for this city at the moment?
We weren't able to get a specific figure just because Watercare's data was a bit unreliable based on the flooding impacts from this year, although they did say that consumer consumption dropped about 1% based on their evaluation this year. But we weren't able to get a gross citywide consumption metric.
Cool. Thank you. They did, yeah, probably one bit of feedback for me back to them, and I'm happy to send it through Ken, is that they did, through the drought, have that so easily available, all that data, and I quite liked having access, and I'm sure many people did too. So how we can get that back, that accessible data of water use across the city is quite, I think, important. Councillor Walker.
Would it be helpful if we joined the Water Sensitive Cities Network? I've raised this before. It could involve collaboration, as occurs in other cities, with the local university. I know Auckland University is up for it, and various parties, you know, more from environmental and others. So would that be helpful? I mean, we're already benchmarking. What do you think of that?
Through the chair, we have considered that, and it was something the Water Sensitive Cities Index guided the development of the strategy and is embedded throughout the direction that it gives. We actually conducted a Water Sensitive Cities Index through the development of the strategy in 2021, and the results of that helped inform the direction that the strategy took. That being said, I think council group staff are investigating that. They're looking into it a bit more. There's some trade-offs to be weighed about the cost of joining the grouping of water-sensitive cities, which I believe comes out to about 50,000 Australian dollars per year and 1 FTE of staff resourcing. And weighing that cost against some of the other potential areas of the strategy that could be implemented with that resourcing to help us move towards becoming a water-sensitive city. And there is direction and advice being developed by council group staff to weigh those costs and benefits, with some of the main benefits of joining the Water Sensitive Cities grouping to be additional training and knowledge management for staff. And so those are being considered, and I think a memo is going to be presented to the committee in several months' time.
I mean, would there be some possibility in reporting to us? I mean, that amount of money compared to Watercare's budget is literally a drop in the bucket. I question whether it would cost that much, and I do note that some of our sister cities, Brisbane, for example, Melbourne, not a sister city, but actively involved in water-sensitive cities. There's a unit that I visited in Monash University. So would it be possible to bring something to us, at least in some form of rough draft, to advance things?
I mean, I took it as that's what Olivia said. So, yes, there is issues, and it was discussed through the water strategy that the way it is set up means it's difficult with our Indigenous lens, the Mātauranga Māori focus of the strategy, is it doesn't exactly match to the water sensitive cities strategy. So we felt like at the time when we went through the water strategy that we were getting the best of both worlds, is that having the data, having the way we could match up and benchmark, but also ensuring that we kept our Te focused plan. So that is coming, councillor, but I think it's, you can't doubt the figures are the figures, and that's an extra cost always on top of what the staff are already doing. As we've already heard, they're all doing this work across the organisation without extra funding right now, so yeah.
Just a supplementary question. It would be my understanding that many other cities have Indigenous populations, not much different to ours, and with similar concepts across water. They're generally common across Indigenous societies, so I'll just leave that. The other question I've got that goes to the water strategy is the recent events have probably emphasised a need for more of a catchment-based approach, which was something that was considered initially, but the water strategy doesn't adequately take that approach on. Is that something that you've considered? And by that, if I just expand, what it means is that you make the observation that there's this amount of water falling on the region, in much the same way as you could adopt that around, sunlight and solar, and then you actively look at what happens with that water. And for example, if you do that and you take a catchment-based approach, it's immediately apparent that Auckland could be entirely self-sufficient in water and not require water from the Waikato. And you can also deploy that approach in respect of stormwater management and the like, so that we're actually making much better use of stormwater and water generally. So is a catchment-based approach something that's under consideration more as the strategy goes forward?
So the strategy does have clear reference to a number of the catchment management activities of council, so it does actually include those sorts of considerations. I guess it's about the nuance that you might look at in terms of whether you're starting to speak about some of those other things that, like supply of water for drinking water, let's say. So I guess it's probably more a case of the focus really being on some of the outcomes that we would like to articulate for the future in terms of how we look at catchment management planning and some of the inputs into the system, into a catchment, and how they're managed. So I think that's probably more the interest for the council, and just bearing in mind that we've got a water services reform progressing that will, make some sort of implications for how that's managed as well. So just wanted to acknowledge that we are taking it on board, Councillor Walker, but obviously there's a lot happening, and we've got our statutory program through the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management.
The last question I've got is whether we're considering further introduction of, let's call them industry standards. So the water cleaning, exterior cleaning industry has developed its own standards, training and the like. They've worked with Watercare on that. There are many other industries, for example, horticulture and others, that could do that. As it stands now, Watercare has no requirement to ensure that any of its water users actually have industry best practice. So the follow-on from that is an enormous amount of water can be wasted with no checks and balances. So is that something that could be considered as integrating into the water strategy, so that we're actually moving into implementation phase around a number of these things? Thanks.
Through the chair, yes. Underneath the water security strategic shift 5, there's an action around developing regulations and targeted information to support Aucklanders, including homes and businesses, around efficient use of water. That action is scoped from years 2 to 5, and it's a joint action by Council and Watercare. So it is something that we'll be looking at in the coming years, definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely already there, Councillor. Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Tess. You know what's coming. So thanks for the information the other day. So obviously within the document, there's an action noting that it's in years 4 to 10 in regard to the use of recycled water, waste treatment water for the likes of irrigation on our playing fields. And there's a feasibility study done where Auckland Council is the second largest commercial user of water in Auckland, and we've got a 30% reduction target over the next 10 years. How can we And I realise that there is a requirement for government to potentially, well, to change their regulations in regards to how we recycle and reuse wastewater. How can we expedite that when you've got, you know, we do have a potential trial or up at Rosedale, and now with an offer of a developer in Cracker across the road from the sports park there to put in the pipes at their cost to connect the waste treatment plant that they're putting in there to enable the Cracker Sports Park, which is is going to be a very large sand-based, needing a lot of water. How can we expedite this? How can we get this in when we're looking at a 30% reduction and we're looking at our aquifers where that water would come from? How are we able to expedite this as part of the strategy? It's already there as being enabled. How can we bring that forward, or how can we push that along?
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Councillor. Yes, there is direction in the strategy around enhancing our wastewater reuse and also how we can use urban roof area to collect rainwater, and there are specific targets in the strategy for those. And we've been working over the past year internally within Council to extend those to our own Council group operations, and that's something that we'd like to do. In the specific reference to the Karaka Sports Field wastewater reuse for irrigation, we do note that there's a lack of regulatory guidance and regulations around the reuse of wastewater for irrigating sports fields, and that through some of those programs going forward, that's something that will be explored. Additionally, WaterCare is collecting data from the Central Interceptor recycled wastewater treatment plant to inform future regulatory discussions in that space to help clear up some of the regulatory barriers there.
Well, thank you. So just a second question in regards to the water harvesting. And so with this strategy, do our rules within the unitary plan align with our desire to harvest water from rainwater? And I'm thinking in particular with in rural settings where our rules can be somewhat contradictory to our desire to protect our water when we have a free dumping, and our own rules preclude us from, or preclude people from being able to do that. Can we align them better?
Yes, absolutely. There's direction in the strategy that's going to have us look at the Auckland Unitary Plan and review it alongside some of the other reforms that will be happening through the freshwater plan change, and then in 2026, the review of the Auckland Unitary Plan. And specifically over the past year, there has been some investigation of the barriers for mandating things like rainwater tanks, for example, some of the legislative barriers that are involved there. So it is something that will be focused on going forward.
Yeah, I'll just add that, you know, there's a number of different other scenarios that Councillor Baker's referring to here, which is, I think, where we need to move to in terms of thinking about those. So I think there's an opportunity through the unitary plan and also our discussions in terms of the central government regulatory framework as to how that might be improved, bearing in mind again that there's a lot of discussion going on at a higher level about how water should be managed more broadly. But we do take your point, and we will take whatever opportunity we can to look at that in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Turner.
Sorry, Councillor Baker basically asked. Thanks.
Any other questions? All good. Well, thank you very much for all the work again, and maybe we'll have a bit of a discussion before the end of the year on how we can get more down to the nitty-gritty of the actions or anything we can do through the LTP, as Councillor Walker said, and other opportunities, because there is a lot to be celebrated beneath all the high-level stuff that's here. So, kia ora.
Kia ora.
Can I have a mover for this? Councillor Turner. Second, Councillor Baker. Kia ora. Is there any debate on this? No? Perfect. Thanks. Very clear. Thank you. All those in favour? Any opposed? No. Thank you. Thanks, team. Right.